Okay, this is the audio review for exam 2, so 351. Okay, so social stratification, there I'm just looking for the definition coming from the chapter, right? That it's a form of, it's a structural inequality, right? That is built into social institutions and basically defines people and separates them in hierarchies, right? And we've talked about all of these different ones: class, race, gender, sexuality, all that fun stuff. So it's really about dividing into groups and then unequally distributing things, right? So creating these group-based inequalities. So life chances just refers to the chances an individual has to experience the good things in life. So meaning, if you have access to good education, jobs, healthcare, etc., that those life chances are affected by class, race, gender, sexuality, etc. Class, race, and gender structures of power, as well as systems that distribute social resources. So that just means that the power relationships in the culture are going to affect the structure of the family. So some of the gendered assumptions in the culture affect the family, right? The fact that we live in a culture with white supremacy, right, means that whites are able to dominate people of color, which affects all sorts of structural things. That we live in a patriarchy where men dominate women, right? That we live in a social class system where the rich dominate the poor, all that kind of stuff. The power resources there. Social class is just the definition that, people occupying a same relative economic rank. How racism affects racial and ethnic families. So basically that it affects their resources that they have available for their families, whether it's economic, social, right? Obviously, the living conditions have a bit of difference because of the results of the inequality, right? And that's kind of what I'm looking for there. Let's see, familism. That's just really talking about an obligation to your family, right? Feeling that the family comes first, and that's prevalent in a lot of minority communities. Family as a gendered institution just means that gender affects the power dynamic of the family, and affects the way that people interact in the family, experience the family, and really what they do in the family, like how they reproduce gender expectations or challenge them. Patriarchy is just the social organization where men dominate women, right? So all just the definition stuff. All right, moving on, chapter 7. So this, I was just looking at the specific numbers of women's employment. We talked about 1940 and 2012, right? So that the number of women in the workforce has gone from 20% to 58%, right? So 20% in 1940 to 58 in 2012. When it comes to problems for women workers, they're still less likely to be employed if they live in a place that has high unemployment than men. And if they're parents, then it's difficult to find, childcare. So issues in childcare are important because if you're not able to provide childcare for your children, then you may not work. Also, employers are looking for people that have flexible work schedules, and if you have to pick up a kid from school, be home on weekends to take care of them, then you're not going to get those positions. Almost 1/3 of households with children have a single parent, right? And in those single parent families, 9 out of 10 of them are women. Gendered labor in the household. There I'm just talking about the expectation that, women work for no pay without, a specific reward. It's just kind of expected labor. And that this even affects women who are also working, what we call the second shift, the expectations that you still do the majority of, housework. Let's see, split shift. So there I'm talking about a strategy, right? And this is from the chapter, that families use, especially working class families that don't have, the economic resources to pay for childcare, to have, a nanny, to have, pay for daycare services, that they will use this kind of split shift parenting where, they will work different work schedules so that they can kind of accommodate for all the needs of the kids without having to pay for childcare. So one will work day, one will work night, that kind of thing. Sequencing is just when you basically time different events over the lifespan to alternate between taking care of kids and working, right? So maybe you take a couple years off to get your kid into like preschool, right? Or something like that. That's a pretty common phenomenon. Let's see, the mommy track. So that's this kind of assumption that women are going to have children. And so that affects whether or not they're promoted. Even if they don't have kids, there's still this assumption that they might, and that's, going to take away from their dedication to their job. So that affects, obviously, the stability of women in the workforce. All right, moving on to chapter 8. So, the first one there, that's just the answer. Intimacy is shaped by society, right? That's self-explanatory. Private selves, public selves, need for intimacy. So that's Goffman's argument, right? That we basically, his whole dramaturgy thing, that we do a front stage, backstage, we perform for others, right? And so in the front stage performance, we create a public self, right? That's interpreted by everybody. This kind of image that we want people to see of us. But that in the backstage performances, right, in the dramaturgical analysis, you have a private self. You have the one that, kind of lies behind the mask. And so the need for intimacy comes from the fact that we create these public selves so that our private selves need to have some connection to be able to be expressed because we're not expressing that out in the world. Okay, so heterosexual mate selection and intimate partnering. So all of this stuff, basically all of these factors affect mate selection and intimate partnering. That's kind of how that works. That's kind of what I'm looking for there. So gender obviously affects this by the kind of gendered assumptions of dating, like who's supposed to pay for a date, who's supposed to initiate sex, things like that. Obviously social class affects, what kind of people you come in contact with, meaning that rich people are very protected in their dating, right? Like they have like cotillions for their fancy rich kids. Versus the poorer you get, the less kind of stricture there is on your, dating, really. So it's basically, there's nowhere but up, right, from there. So there's not as much control, right? So that has a lot to do with that as well. Race, obviously, the fact that we live in very segregated society, right, that still has a lot of, when it comes to neighborhood segregation, who you come in contact with is ultimately who you end up dating. So if we're living in segregated neighborhoods, we're not coming in contact with people that are different than us, right? Unless obviously you're in a integrated setting like the military, at a university, or just really living in a larger metropolitan area. It's going to affect who you come in contact with and who you actually date. And then, of course, immigration status, right? That, the dating practices that people have to do with their cultural identities, right? So if someone's a first-generation immigrant, they are going to have a different interpretation of dating rituals than someone, they're going to maybe have more traditional values from their country of origin than someone who's second generation who grows up with the cultural expectations. Okay, and then when it comes to the social constructionist approach, again, that's just the idea that when it comes to dating, intimacy, relationships, that it's not, what we desire, what we think is sexual, is not something that's just biological or innate. It's something that's culturally affected, right? So, meaning we're socially constructing what's appropriate and what's not. So, tenets of social construction theory is just that human sexuality varies throughout time, right? And even the life of an individual, right? What's normal when you're a kid versus when you get old is going to change, right? It's actually changing quite quickly in our culture. And that while sexuality is very personal, it's also affected by social understandings in society that label us and categorize us and affect us, right? And of course, these other intersections also matter, meaning the way we see sexuality also has to do with race, class, gender, right? And all of that stuff. So it's not just biology that affects the way that, we understand, any particular factor like sexuality, right? The way that it's socially constructed. Okay, so then the sexual revolution. So here, this is that, I wanted to kind of point out the Jean Kilbourne clip from the lecture, right? About advertising and how it harms men and women. So really she talks about how, advertising has a terrible effect on society because it trivializes sex and it makes it about selling stuff, right? And so the way that we do this is often through photoshopping women like into parts and decompartmentalizing them, and just looking at them as sexual objects. So this affects the way that women internalize the cultural values and also the way men evaluate real women in their lives when they compare them to these photoshopped things that don't exist, right? And of course, advertising is really just all about trying to associate a healthy sexuality with youth, which is very problematic for a lot of reasons, right? And so it keeps, children at younger and younger ages sexualizing them and kind of preferencing that, you know, um, the media, really wants, freshness, youth, this or that, that if you're a certain age, you're just, not sexual anymore, or any of these kind of ways that it constructs this. And again, it has problematic features in our society when the average age of models is now teenagers versus, when I was a kid, supermodels were like in their 20s. And so it's interesting how the cultural model changes, and it kind of excuses away a lot of these predatory behaviors towards young women. All right, HIV is a disease of color. Just there that there's disproportionate rates in African American communities of HIV. And so this really does have more of a reflection of the health disparities, right, between groups. So really, what I want you to know there is like from that part of the chapter, they talk about some of the numbers, right? How disproportionate the amount of people that have cases of AIDS are, meaning, if you're talking about 13% of the population, then, nearly half, so like 46%, but nearly half of all new AIDS cases are found in African American communities. And so that's obviously a way disproportionate amount. So African American women are diagnosed at a rate 20 times higher than that of white women, while African American men are diagnosed at a rate 7 times higher than white men. So obviously there's some sort of inequality that's affecting the way that people have, different health outcomes and health disparities. So that's kind of what it means about it being a disease of color. Teen sexuality, there I'm just talking about how, teen sexuality is less controlled than in previous generations, right? And it does lead to teen pregnancy, which, this next question also asks about this idea of early motherhood making people vulnerable, meaning it's difficult to graduate. It's difficult to kind of get your life together if you're a teenager and you have a kid. But really, it's the young women that are poor when they have the kid that it keeps them in locked in poverty, right? There are plenty of, richer middle class women that also get pregnant as teens, but it doesn't affect them in the long term economically because they have the financial support to get through that, right? Gender, love, and sex. So they're just about how, again, social constructions affect the way we see things. So if gender is a major factor in our social constructions, then men and women are going to expect different things out of relationships. So if men are taught to focus on, their performance sexually as, what's the most important thing, while women are trying to focus on, finding emotional connection that has meaning, then obviously, that's going to cause all sorts of conflicts when there's different expectations of relationships and different perceptions of what's happening. Race and intimacy, same deal. The way that these things are socially constructed, the way that society and history has worked to affect racial relations, obviously affects the way that people interpret, either who's sexy or, in the hierarchy of white supremacy, white bodies are privileged. So, and not to mention, obviously, that for the legal restriction between interracial marriage for so many years, literally like legally kept people away from having these kind of relationships. So, it makes sense that the racial hierarchy in society and also the just history and the fact that we live in segregated neighborhoods is obviously going to affect, who people end up with and who they find attractive. All right, moving on to chapter 9. Okay, so lifespan. So this is just about how like more people get divorced now because, well, not just because of this, but one of the factors in divorce is the fact that like people live a lot longer now, right? So, forever seems great when you're 20 and you think like, yeah, if you're only living 50 years, then like you can do 30 years. That's like, an upstate bid kind of situation. You could do that. But if you're going to live like 100 years, it's a long ass time to be with someone, right? So a lot of people, just because, of being, age and time, they grow apart, and so it can lead to divorce. When it comes to recent trends, obviously interracial marriage is a much more culturally recent trend because, again, it was legally restricted until the late 1960s. in some states. So obviously that's going to affect those things, but it is increasing. But again, there are ways in which interracial marriage is still frowned upon, or is still kind of stigmatized in the culture. When it comes to benefits of marriage, we talked about how there are some, turns out, better health, meaning physical and mental health, better sex lives, right? And more economic resources that are pooled together. But we talked also about how the benefits of that changes when you look at different social factors like race, class, and gender, right? So when race comes in, right, there are different disparities because people are experiencing racial inequality. Same thing with class and gender inequality, meaning that the way that, like for women, the way they experience a marriage is going to matter based on how, the quality of the marriage, right? Or social class, the benefit of marriage of collecting your resources doesn't help when you're both broke, right? So those benefits change when you start looking at different groups. When it comes to the difference between a husband's marriage and a wife's marriage, right? The husband's marriage, that just means that in general, in this kind of, heteronormative expectation, right? That men are going to, in general, receive more benefits from marriage, right? Oftentimes, more health benefits, meaning they tend to live longer if they're married, versus for women, there isn't really a significant difference. Husbands receive more social support and caring than they return, right? And they tend to work, outside the home and still have to provide for the family. And there's expectations that are tied to that and patriarchy. And even if they are expected to like go home and contribute to the family labor, they aren't really expected to contribute 50-50, right? For childcare, emotional work, housework, all that kind of stuff. So for wives, that's why it's a little bit less beneficial, right? The wives' marriage is a little less beneficial. And again, for them, it's going to depend on the quality of the marriage itself, because if they're dealing with like a violent situation or otherwise abusive or emotionally, psychologically abusive situation, then they're likely to experience health problems as a result of that, right? And it's going to affect their immune systems. And of course, psychologically. And then, so it also just matters when you look at the power differentials, right? The expectations of patriarchy say, a man is the king of the castle, etc. And so the kind of structure of the traditional family models itself around that hierarchy, right? So that means that for women, if you have to deal with the patriarchal expectations or, kind of the second shift expectations of childcare and housework, then yeah, it's not as great. All right, different kinds of marriages. All right, so here I'm just going to kind of go through these ones a little bit quickly because I'm not going to actually test you on all of these ones. Okay, conflicted habitual, right? So those are the ones who just like constantly fight all the time, right? So like they don't know how to deal with their arguments. They are constantly, exploiting each other, very argumentative, all that fun stuff. For devitalized, those are people who at some point were connected, were in love, but they have drifted apart and they're still together, but they're really just kind of like going through the motions or doing it a sense of like duty, or maybe because they have kids or something like that. Passive congenial marriages are ones where people didn't really expect love from the outset, but, are open to the possibility or open, to the opportunity of that. Vital marriages, some people in passive congenial, sorry to go back, are just, they might have gotten to a point where they feel like, well, I just need to get married, right? So they're not really at the place where they found some, soulmate partner or whatever, but they feel kind of, they got to go through X, Y, and Z. But they are still open to those possibilities in those relationships. Vital marriages are those where basically the other part or the partner that you have is where you find all your satisfaction, right? So your relationship with this other person is kind of like what your world is, right? So you're, have intimacy in every factor, right? Whether it's sexual, whether it's emotional, right? And having kind of like support for each other and all that fun stuff. Total marriages are basically vital marriages, but vital marriages with healthy relationships with other people as well, meaning vital marriages can be somewhat problematic in the fact that, I mean, obviously they're like the ideal that we see in like romance movies or whatever, but in reality, you can't be everything for everyone, for like one person, meaning you can't be, all things. They also need family and friends and other support systems. So total marriages are where you still have that same vital marriage, but you also have like other things in your life than just that one person. All right, factors that influence marriage quality. There's a bunch of them. So just kind of review those ones, right? We talked about all those different characteristics that people have. So, your age, your race, your class, right? Whether or not you have role fit, right? Which is a big one, meaning like how much can you agree on what should be done, whether it's raising a kid or household stuff or buying things or any of those kind of stuff, right? That how do you make decisions? And then, of course, the life cycle itself, right? That's obviously going to affect marriage quality because as people age, right, then typically it affects the quality or the kind of connection of their marriage. Obviously, if you're dealing with like mobility issues or health issues, that's going to affect the quality, right, as you age. Um, and then building an egalitarian marriage. There, I'm just talking about how egalitarian marriages are kind of trying to move past the gendered system of expectations of household labor and instead, let people make decisions about, what's going to be done in the marriage or in the relationship, like equally, right? And so this tends to cause a lot of satisfaction where people feel like they are equally supported and they have like a partner, right? And that's kind of like the understanding of more modern relationships is trying to build an egalitarian marriage. Alrighty. The ones from the family issues readers, these are again, the answers are pretty much sitting right here for you, but whatever, I'll say them out loud. All right, so number 7, and again, the numbers just refer to the number order they are in the family issues reader book. So article, he says, she says, there, I just want you to focus on that little passage they talk about the gender disadvantages of cohabitation. So just meaning that, basically women often think that either basically because the way the society dictates relationships, it's like compulsory marriage is expected. So when people cohabitate, there's this idea that somehow, especially for women, they internalize the cultural expectations on them to be married. So they tend to see their cohabitation as less legitimate than like a married couple, right? Even though they're pretty similar as far as like day-to-day life experience, but because they didn't go through like that particular social rite of passage, they consider the relationship to be less valid, right? Okay, so reading number 8 there. Let's see here. That was another one about cohabitation, right? And really, again, right here, that's what I'm looking for on the exam, right? That some women who are cohabitating are reluctant to bring up marriage because they don't want to destabilize the relationship, right? Okay, so from number 36, that reading, and again, all listed on your syllabus. If you're like, what's number 36? Again, like you should be reading the book. It's number 36 in the book. Anyway, colorism, just the definition that they give, right? Which is this internalized skin tone bias that comes from our kind of white supremacist culture that's based on skin color, hair texture, facial features, right? And so basically says that white features are preferenced, right? So colorism means that it's not just about between group racism, it's like within group racism, right? Meaning even within racial groups, people are preferenced if they're lighter skinned or have more European features. All right, why do I keep describing it? It's right there. Okay, number 3. Okay, so this one was about, this was that direct and indirect messages that African American women receive from their family networks about intimate relationships and sex. And so for that one, I was asking like which women or like who did the women receive the information from the most, right? They talk about 3 different groups that women receive information from, right? Women from previous generations, meaning their aunts, their moms, people like that, grandmother, or women from the same generation, right? Siblings, friends, things like that, cousins, whatever, or from male role models, fathers, other male figures in their lives. So of those 3 groups, they said that they received the most information from women of previous generations, right? Meaning they learned a lot more about what's appropriate dating, what's appropriate relationship quality, what they should be looking for in a man, all those kind of things from their aunt, from their mom, from their grandma. Number 14. Okay, so that one was about like the different, basically like how relationships vary within either partnerships or repartnerships. So looking specifically at gay couples and repartnerships, again, the answer's right there. I'm just reading it to you at this point. But anyway, that they reported higher relationship quality and cohesion than first partnerships, right? Sometimes when it comes to relationships, you learn from the experiences, right? And you kind of know more of what you're looking for. But anyway, so that's kind of the answer to that. That's what I'm looking for there. And then for the essay question, this is obviously based on the film that we watched in class. And so, this is just your interpretation of what you saw in the film. So, what anxieties do the family members experience as they confront the realization of a homosexual child or spouse, right? So, you saw that there were some reactions that differed, right, among parents, among spouses. Some were supportive, some were not at all. Some weren't at first and then came around, right? So, I kind of want you to develop that a little bit to talk about the kind of variety in the experiences or the ways that kind of manifested and why. Like why would that be a experience that would cause anxiety, right? What does that have to do with the kind of social power dynamics, right? And then what anxieties do, or just even what experiences are those gay and lesbian individuals having in relationship to their families? Meaning, what's their experience of that? Like as they're coming out or as they're, kind of, their family becomes aware, how do they feel? How do they navigate it, right? And again, it's not one singular experience. It's a variety of experiences. So kind of just the different ways in which that's now. You don't have to tell me like the specific name of the specific person or things like that. Like it doesn't have to be that detailed. You don't have to stress out about that. What I'm really looking for there is just to kind of really talk about how, these things manifested differently in relationship to people's religion, in relationship to power dynamics, all those kind of things, right? Alrighty, so that is the study guide exam 2 review.